Alright, so today we're going to take a look at democracy in the colonies, and specifically we're going to look at women's rights at about the time we went from being the colonies to an independent country. We can sum it up this way. Rights are very important to our country. They are the beliefs that we hold dear, but in colonial times, rights were limited to a small group of usually just white Protestant men that owned property, and over time rights were extended to more groups. Women were one of the last groups in our country to have rights extended to them. So you think about colonial days, and if we zoom in on this picture, you see men in a room making decisions. What don't you see? You don't see any women in that room. So, in colonial days, if you were a woman, that meant you could not vote. You could not own property. Usually you couldn't even go to a public meeting, and you definitely could not hold public office. So rights for women were very limited in colonial times, and also when we first became an independent country. So let's think about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is a very important American. He is the writer of the Constitution, and we can say that Jefferson is the typical man of his day. So what did the typical man of his day believe? He believed that education for a woman could be limited to how do you take care of children, how do you take care of your home, and a little bit of a music. Jefferson was a little bit different from many of the other men in that he allowed his daughters to also learn how to read. So when he wrote this Declaration of Independence, he really didn't include women in that. He thought their appropriate role in life was to be in the home. And the last thing that I want to point out here on this slide, and we'll circle it, is that for most of our history, the hardest working people in the colonies were the women. Most people lived on farms, and women did chores exactly like the men. They planted the crops, they weeded the crops, they harvested the crops, they slaughtered animals, and in addition to doing just as hard physical work as their husbands, they also had the job of running the house. Let me see if I click out of that, and we'll go to the next one. Okay, so I like this term here, and I'll circle it quick. It says house slave. So it's an interesting word, but to me it kind of sums up the status of a woman in the colonies. Her job was really to be a wife, a mother, or a daughter. I'll give you an interesting thing here. That suppose a woman gets married, and then after she gets married her husband dies. Well, who is in control of the property that those two had made together during their lives? It's not the woman. It would fall to the eldest son. So if it's okay for me to review a little bit here, things women couldn't do. They couldn't own private property. They could not vote. They could not serve on juries. If a woman did work outside of her home, all of that money belonged to her husband. Her main job, as I said before, was to take care of the children. If a woman did not get married, then it's like to take care of your elderly parents. So the next step here is we'll just go over this one really quickly. The American Revolution was one of those events in history that makes a difference for women. And it made a difference for women in that because the country was at war, they were able to step outside of their traditional roles. So groups like the Daughters of Liberty formed to support independence. Women also supported independence by not buying British goods. Many times, women did things like make their own clothes instead of buying British clothes, and many women that were educated and could read and write wrote letters to the newspapers supporting independence. In some rare cases, women followed their husbands into battle. So this is a portrait of Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams was the wife of John Adams. John Adams is an important American. He was one of the first patriots to suggest that the colonies become an independent country. So he was supportive of the war against Britain, and he was the second president of the United States, and he was also a delegate at the Constitutional Convention. Now, Abigail, when she sent John off to Philadelphia to work on the Constitution, begged her husband to please remember the ladies as the men were writing this document. Unfortunately for Abigail, John did not ignore her. In our original Constitution, the rights that are dispensed are given to men and not women. Like I said at the start of my talk, rights were a thing in our country's history that gradually had to be pushed for other groups besides white men to have. This is the last piece that I'm going to go over here, and it's all about education. So in colonial times and in the earliest part of our history as an independent country, most families didn't educate their daughters. Let me say that again. Most families did not educate their daughters. Look at the literacy statistic from 1750. In 1750, 90% of adult white men could read. On the other hand, in 1750, only about 40% of women could read. Education is the great equalizer. So when you deprive a group of an education, it keeps them from getting a better life. Education is the ticket to a better life. Literacy is the ticket to a better life. The better you read, the farther you'll go. So I could go on and on about this all day, but one of the reasons that women had this unequal status in our society was because they were denied an education. So that's going to conclude our little mini lesson today on what it was like for a woman to be living during the late colonial period to the earliest time when we were an independent country.